Hey, young pros, it is so good to be back with you on week 2 of Esther. This is the greatest story. It's one of the greatest stories in this book, the Bible, that we read because it's full of intrigue and mystery and ups and downs and the irony. Wait until we get near the end of this story. It has one of the most ironic endings of any story, any movie, any book that you will ever read. So I'm going to talk really quickly today because we have to cover a ton of material. So let me review what we talked about last week, the 3-act structure. Remember, Robert McKee wrote the book Story, and he said in any great story, in any great movie script, in any great movie that you ever watch, there's 3 acts. You have Act 1, which is the introduction. You have Act 2, which is the main part of the story. It's the conflict. Robert McKee, remember, said conflict is to story what sound is to music. You cannot have music without sound, nor can you have a great story without conflict. That's why every great story, every great movie that you and I have ever watched, the characters in this increasing conflict, and we as an audience are sitting there thinking, are they going to survive, or are they going to learn the lesson they need to learn? Act 3 is the climax, the resolution of the story. It's where it's all wrapped up. But at the end of Act 1, remember the very beginning, at the end of Act 1, you have what's called the inciting incident. And the inciting incident is what changes the status quo. It launches the characters on a quest, on a journey. Their lives will never be the same. So William Wallace, his wife is killed, and it launches him on a quest, on a journey. His life will never be the same. Finding Nemo. Nemo is captured. It launches him and his dad on a quest, on a journey. Their lives will never be the same. So every great story starts with Act 1, the setting. Once upon a time in a land far, far away. And then you get the inciting incident. Well, Esther, remember we saw it last week, it's beautifully set up this way. And so remember, in a sense, it starts with once upon a time in a land far, far away lived a king, King Xerxes, the Persian Empire, the other side of the world, 2,600 years ago. And the story begins by setting it up with this powerful king, the Persian Empire. History class, remember, 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, they come, they take over most of the world, they surround Jerusalem, they destroy the city, they destroy the temple, they drag people off into captivity. About 50 years later, the Persians take over the Babylonian Empire. So some of these Jews that had been taken into captivity are now no longer under the Babylonians, they're under the Persians. That's where we find this story. So remember King Xerxes, if you remember chapter 1 of last week, King Xerxes throws this massive party that lasts for 6 months. Can you imagine a party for 6 months throughout the whole empire? Then he takes this party back to his own city, and for 7 days there's this party that's going on and on and on. And this is where we're starting to approach the inciting incidents where we left off last week. I'm going to read verse 10. We're going to pick it up in Esther chapter 1, verse 10. On the 7th day, this party's been going on for 7 days. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was high in spirits from wine, remember the earlier verses said the wine was flowing freely. So that's a biblical way of saying they're drunk, okay? King Xerxes was high in spirits from wine. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, and then it lists their names, and I can't say all their names. So keep reading. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, verse 11, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Now, theologians believe different things about this. Some believe that what he's saying is, bring Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown. Like that's all she was wearing. We don't know for sure, but it would seem that might be the case because of what happens. Here comes the inciting incident. Now watch this. Remember the inciting incident. Changes the status quo, and it will launch the characters on a quest, on a journey. Their lives would never, ever, ever be the same. Look at verse 12. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. You see, if you were sitting in a movie theater at this point, you should lean over to your friend and said, there's the inciting incident. Because the story changes now. Queen Vashti, King Xerxes, some characters that were going to be introduced in the next chapter, Their lives will never be the same because of what Queen Vashti does in verse 12. He seems, King Xerxes furious. He gets upset, seems to be a little insecure. If you read the next verses, he calls in a bunch of his leaders and he asks them, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? They tell him, you know what? If you let Queen Vashti get away with this, we're going to have a problem with the women in the empire. In fact, verse 18 of chapter 1, you should put a little star next to that in your Bibles. If you have a hard copy, you should put a little star next to verse 18 and say, this is disgusting in the margin. Here's how the Message paraphrases verse 18. The attendants, the leaders, tell King Xerxes, is this what we want, a country of angry women who don't know their place? I know all the women right now went, ooh, and all the guys, we should be too. You know, just this isn't even what we're going to talk about today, but I can't help, especially with the climate of our country right now, I cannot help but say this. I must say this, that when we look at the most abused people group in the history of this world, it's not black people. Oh, it's horrible what has happened and what our country has done for hundreds of years. The injustices done to African Americans. Jewish people have been abused throughout history. And we know in our last century, 6 million of them were killed. But you know who the most abused people group on this planet? Without a doubt, women. You can go to any culture in any society at any time in history, and you will see that so often women, instead of being treated the way that God intended them to be treated, they have been abused and raped and put down and told that they're second-class citizens. And so when we read this passage in verse 18 of chapter 1, it should bring a sick feeling to our stomach. That these leaders are going to King Xerxes and saying, hey, if you don't do something about this, the women in our country are not going to know their place. Skip down to verse 22. Again, I'm going to read how the Message paraphrases it because it does a brilliant job here. It says that he sent bulletins to every part of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, to each people in their own language. Every man is a master of his own house. Whatever he says goes. And chapter 1 ends. So chapter 1, you have this inciting incident. Queen Vashti says, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do. She gets banished. The leaders tell the king, you better do something about this. So he sends out this notice in all the languages they spoke in the Persian Empire saying, hey, men are in power. It's going to stay that way. In small print, you could say, we're going to continue to abuse women. Chapter 2 now, we're introduced to 2 other main characters. In fact, one of them is, this book is named after her. And again, like I said last week, we need to understand this is not a Disney princess story. When I was growing up, it was flannel graph. That's how we learned these stories in church, which I'm showing how old I am. But the flannel graph story that they told of Esther was a Disney princess story. And they had to do that because we were children. This is not a Disney princess story. We already see that from chapter 1, but wait until you see what happens in chapter 2. There's a big space that happens here. Remember, I said there's about a decade that the story of Esther takes place in. But between the end of chapter 2 and Queen Vashti refusing to go dance in front of a bunch of drunk men, there's about 4 years. There's a span of about 4 years. So you got to think that this doesn't just happen in a couple of weeks or months. Years are passing. So we pick it up, Esther chapter 2, verse 1. Later, and that's probably months or years. By the end of this chapter, it's going to be 4 years. Later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. So it seems like he's almost second-guessing his decision here. Verse 2. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. They're going to go on. If you read the next verses, they're going to consult the king to tell him to do a beauty contest. Verse 4, skip down to verse 4. The young woman who most pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. Now, in the margin of your Bible, next to chapter 2, verse 4, you should write the words, yuck. You've probably heard the phrase before about men being pigs. I don't think all men are. I hope I'm not. But in this case, this is a group of men being pigs. Vashti refuses to come out and dance, probably naked, in front of a bunch of drunken men, and so she's banished. She went from being a queen to basically a prisoner. And then these slobs of men come up with this idea, hey, let's find a new queen. How? A beauty contest. Not a Disney princess beauty contest, mind you. Now, this is a messy situation, and this is the hope for you and I. Because when we look around our world right now, when you look at your own life, when I look at my life, guess what? It's messy sometimes. And what we see in the midst of this very messy, disgusting story, this perverted sexuality, God is working. What? God is working. Verse 4. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. I bet it did appeal to the king. Let's go find the prettiest virgin in the whole country, and she'll be my queen? I like that idea. Look at verse 5 and 6. Now, this is where we're introduced to one of the main characters, and this is a key character. Now, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew. Remember, 50 years before, they were dragged into captivity. There was a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai. Don't forget that name. The son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with the king of Babylon. So Mordecai is dragged into slavery. He's now in this capital city. He's seen all this happen. Now, we're going to come back to him in a moment. Hang on to his name. But look at this, verse 7. We're introduced to this next character. Mordecai has a cousin named, that name, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. So she's an orphan girl. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Key to the story. In fact, you should underline those words. She was beautiful in form and features. Why would you underline that in the Bible? Because it's key to the story. See, at this point in the story, you would think, and I'm going to be crass for a moment. Here's what it's saying there in verse 7. She was smoking hot. That's what it's saying. And at this point in the story, you're thinking that's all Esther has. Like she was the smoking hot woman. Oh, we're going to find out that there was so much more to Esther. There was so much more to Esther. But here's another, and this isn't my point of what I want to teach today, but I think it's an important spot just to put this in. That beauty is skin deep. It's not that the Bible is saying that her beauty was wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. God created her that way. But Proverbs speaks about this. Proverbs 31:30 says, charm is deceptive, beauty doesn't last, but a woman who fears the Lord will be greatly praised. Beauty is skin deep. And so is the strength of men. Psalms talks about that. The strength of men. You know, guys, when they're young, they're so excited and proud of how strong they are and what they can do, and we're going to lose it. Go walk through a nursing home today. We all pretty much look the same. We've lost our beauty. We've lost our strength. We've lost our... So it's not that these things are wrong. It's that there's so much more than that. And what we're going to see is this woman named Esther, who is so beautiful that when they go through and do this beauty contest through this whole entire empire, she's one of the many women that is taken. By the way, taken. This is why it's not like this beauty contest, Disney princess beauty. They were taken. They were literally kidnapped from their families and taken. Well, Esther's taken. She's put through this extreme makeover. If you read the next verses, she has 7 maids assigned to her that are trying to make her beautiful for 12 months. For an entire year, she has other maids, women that are trying to help her look beautiful, even more beautiful than she was. Look at verse 10. Critical to the story. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Verse 11, every day, we're going to stop here, so I want you to hold on to this verse. Verse 11, every day Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. Now, when it says that he walked next to the courtyard of the harem, again, this is where I want us to understand this is not a Disney princess story. Because I know some of you have maybe heard the story of Esther before, and you're like, oh, there was a beauty contest, the women were brought in, they were made to look beautiful, and no, they were kidnapped, they were brought to the king's palace, they were put in this for a year, they're put through this beautifying process. One of them is going to chosen to be the queen, and the others are going to be part of his harem, which means they will never again see their families. They will live in the palace. They will be basically sex slaves. Eunuchs will be in charge of them. Eunuchs were men who were sexually mutilated, so the king didn't have to worry about them messing with his harem. See, this isn't a Disney princess story. But yet we see God working in the midst of this gross, disgusting story. Verse 11, every day Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard and find out about Esther and what was happening to her. If you know anything about the story, spoiler alert, if you know anything about the story, you're going to see that Mordecai is a key figure in the life of Esther. And here's the question I want to leave you with today. Who is your Mordecai? Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20 says, become wise by walking with the wise. Proverbs 13:20, become wise by walking with the wise. Proverbs 2:2, turn your ears to the world of wisdom. Proverbs 2:3-5, that's right, if you make insight your priority and won't take no for an answer, searching for insight and wisdom like a prospector panning for gold, like an adventure on a treasure hunt, believe me, before you know it, the fear of God will be yours. See, you may have heard this before, but if I took some time with every one of you and I found out the 5 people that you spend the most time with, the 5 people that have the biggest influence in your life, I can tell you who you will be in a year. If I spent some time and I found the 5 people that have the greatest influence in your life, I'll tell you who you're going to be in a year. The Bible again and again and again speaks about the importance of who is influencing us. And again, I would ask you, who is your Mordecai? Esther, she's going to be the hero of the stories. You're going to see, oh my goodness, what a hero she was. But part of the reason she was that hero is because she had someone like Mordecai in her life. I come from a very broken background. In fact, I lived on my own for half of high school. I didn't know what it was like to be a good man, a man of God. I didn't know what it was like to be a good husband, a good father. And I look back on my life and I think of the 3 or 5 things that have had the biggest impact in my life, I would say one of them was recognizing as a young man that my future depended on who I chose as my mentors. And so I can look back on my life and I can see a Mr. Reimer and a Mr. Morey and a Mark and an Isaiah. I could name 5 or 6 other men that I look back and I go, these were my Mordecais that radically changed the trajectory of my life. Who's your Mordecai? God, may we get that. May we understand this truth. This is such an amazing story. And Esther, we're going to see how, what a heroine for all of us, this hero of the faith. But part of it was because you put a Mordecai in her life. Part of it is because she chose to listen to the wisdom of Mordecai. So God, I pray that we would accept this challenge and just wrestle with who is our Mordecai. And if we don't have a Mordecai, God, that we would do whatever it takes to go find one. We love you, Jesus. Amen.